This
They can type
conference
them
will
in
now be recorded.
if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat window, and we will answer them at the end. Go ahead, Sean. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. So welcome everyone to this ISB GAMP session, this knowledge sharing session on maturity modeling for records and data integrity. We certainly live in interesting times, for good and bad. There's a lot happening in terms of regulatory guidance in the area of data integrity. The PICS Draft 3 has just been published, the finalized US FDA guide, lots of excellent work happening in the DISIG and the GPG teams. So certainly no lack of activity. And one characteristic of interesting times, there's often continuous change, often over a relatively short timescale. And I think we're seeing a change, an evolution in the overall approach to data integrity. This could be seen as an oversimplification, but I think there certainly is a general trend. I think we started off initially driven by rapid, sometimes short-term responses to critical or major DI citations. So there was often a kind of tactical response to some key regulatory focus areas. Activities were roughly prioritized then according to regulatory visibility. So they were focused on some important issues, but they weren't necessarily strategic, consistent, or complete or holistic. Then we moved to a more integrated data integrity program driven, somewhat bottom up, sometimes system-based, assessment-driven approach was often the engine within these programs. Good for coverage, good for consistency, but not so good on prioritization of areas, and not so good on being truly patient and quality risk-driven, and not always truly integrated with the QMS and truly embedded in the culture. Now I think, which is a very good thing, we're seeing more of a focus on the bigger picture. Leadership, culture, the wider QMS, organizational excellence, something I'll come back to, and obviously organizational maturity, which is the topic today. I think this has traditionally been the case in the past for overall GXP inspections by a lot of the mature regulators like the MHRA, but I think we're now seeing a more integrated approach where wider organizational aspects like culture and maturity is considered rather in a holistic way, rather than it being treated as a specific different technical or regulatory topic. In many ways, we're seeing that DI is equally an indicator of maturity because it's a key supporting element as well as an outcome. So we've got this very volatile layer of different approaches to DI on top of a fairly stable set of regulations and principles that remain fairly static. But I think we're also seeing above all of this a wider paradigm shift, to use a phrase that the MHRA used very recently in an ISP conference to describe it. And a lot of this is a move from a purely compliance-driven approach to a truly quality and risk-driven approach, where we're thinking more about excellence, maturity, continuous improvement, and obviously innovation, which I think is one of the things that should be driving us. So today I'd like to start off actually with something else that's come out from the US FDA in the last couple of weeks, and this is the Center for Devices Enforcement and Quality Report, because I think there's some interesting points there. Then we'll move on to more detail on how maturity modeling is covered in the RDI guide, and then move on to links to other GAMP good practice and other ISBE guides. So this document was published in November, and it's the Medical Device Enforcement and Quality Report. And I think it's always valuable for pharma to keep an eye on what's happening in medical devices, because some of the innovations and the changes often surface in the medical device world in the same way that Q9 was very much inspired by ISO 14971. So risk-based approaches in medical devices are kind of transferred to pharma. Then I think there's a lot of interesting things in this report that's relevant to the topic today. One of the points it makes is what I mentioned there with the paradigm shift, promoting quality, not just compliance with the regulations. Compliance with regulations is a baseline level, but it's not sufficient. So traditional compliance and enforcement actions are not sufficient, and a focus on true quality enables better alignment of patient safety and business objectives. And as part of this, a focus on organizational maturity. And in fact, they've launched a voluntary quality maturity appraisal pilot. And this is where a certain number of organizations have undergone voluntary quality maturity appraisals by third parties, not focused on compliance or regulations per se, but focused on continuous improvement and organizational excellence. And there's some advantages in enrolling in this, not only obviously working towards improvement, but the FDA in the meantime are going to forego surveillance and pre-approval inspections for those manufacturing sites. So there's an advantage there as well. And this maturity appraisal approach is based on the CMMI, Capability Maturity Model Integration Framework, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and will be very well aware of. It started in the software world. It came out of Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute in '91, and then it's been lifted out into its own institute in 2012. But it's a very widely used framework. So this is the FDA putting their money where their mouth is, really, and saying, okay, we do believe that organizational maturity is an important driver for quality and excellence, and we are going to support it. So let's look at the work that's already been done in the Records and Data Integrity Guide, and then we'll move on to links to some other information in other GAMP good practice guides and ISPE guides. I don't think many of you will need an introduction to the RDI guide. I'll call it the RDI guide for short. It's the guide that sits next to, at the same level as GAMP 5, but with GAMP 5 focusing on the system lifecycle, the RDI guide focuses on the data lifecycle. So I think with both in place, we've got all the big all the big topics covered in our GAMP documents. It starts off with defining what the regulatory focus is and what the data integrity requirements are in quite high level overview, but then very, very quickly moves on to the definition of a data governance framework. And when we're talking about maturity in this area, we're often talking about the maturity of the structures, the processes, and the activities that make up this data governance framework. So that's what we mean, and that's the definition in the guide, which, if memory serves me correct, is probably a definition that we borrowed from MHRA. So data governance, the sum total of arrangements to ensure that data is recorded, processed, retained, and used to ensure a complete, consistent, and accurate record. So it's the sum total of arrangements. So we need to ensure that we have an appropriate level of maturity for all these arrangements. Some other reminders there from the regulators. There shouldn't be a standalone or bolt-on activity. It should be integral to the quality system, and there should be balance. The effort and resource assigned to any data governance should be commensurate with the risk. So it should be a balanced, commensurate approach, and also balanced with all the other activities that the organization must take to protect itself and also the safety of the patient. And many of these structures and processes will be to do with applying the appropriate behavioral steps or controls to do with the people and how they behave, the procedural controls, the processes, the SOPs, etc., as well as the technical controls, the technology, the types of things that are delivered by the systems, where the systems life cycle is defined by GAMP 5. So that's how it links in quite well there with GAMP 5 itself. And that shows you the overall data governance framework. And when we are thinking and talking about maturity, we need to be thinking about our maturity in the activities and the processes that deliver all of these things. And it's no surprise that a lot of the things that we'll talk about, leadership, culture, ownership, awareness, etc., they're right there at the top. This is something from the data governance section that, again, we've proudly borrowed from a regulator, and in fact, it was the MHRA in conferences that made this point, and we felt it was so important that we had to include it in the guide. In fact, it was David Churchwood, I think, who communicated it very articulately, that we can't just depend on stringent policing, auditing, etc. We can't just depend on validated systems and technical controls. In order to achieve what we need in terms of maturity and quality, we need to ensure that all staff are aware and understand of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the potential impact is on the organization, on the public, on the patients, etc. So our aim for this data integrity framework, and the final aim, I think, for many of these continuous improvement maturity activities will be that everyone in the organization routinely follows accepted good practices and principles because they're aware and they understand. We can't depend on policing and technical controls to prevent users from doing the right thing. We want people to naturally do the right thing because they understand why. And I think this will be reflected in the maturity model, which starts off with a lot of cultural and behavioral and leadership aspects. I have to acknowledge Mark Newton for some of the ideas on this slide. In discussion when we were developing the RDI guide, he made the point that there was an overall very high level continuum of organizations. The less mature organizations manage to the best they can the current as-is situation, and their controls are based on procedures typically aimed at detecting failures. So we assume there'll be failures, so we have to put a lot of double checks and procedures that are as effective as we can in finding these failures. As we get into more mature organizations, then they start to modify the processes and to modify systems to use appropriate technical controls if available. And they also evaluate systems formally for gaps prior to use, or potentially retrospectively if the systems are already in place. And I suspect that a lot of the organizations in life science sector are in that kind of middle group. But the most mature organizations, where we should be aiming to be, design integrity into processes before the systems and technology are purchased, and only purchase systems that can be configured to meet these requirements. Now, obviously, this means understanding processes. This needs an understanding of data flow. It needs an understanding of requirements. So there's a lot of effort involved in moving from being a more mature organization to a most mature organization. But we can drill down to a far lower level to figure out, okay, well, what does it mean for the elements of data governance to sort of move on this journey from less to most? And that led us to include in the RDI guide, the Records and Data Integrity Guide, a maturity model, which is an approach to assessing the DI maturity level of an organization at whatever scope you wish to define. And it's a representation of that organization based on the status of some essential elements of effective data integrity. And it was very much inspired and leaning on concepts of the capability maturity model integration, CMMI, but it's not linked or affiliated in any way. And just to get some aims and objectives clear, the aim of this tool is to help improve existing work practices. It doesn't define what those work practices should be for any given activity or company. So that's the job of the company. There's guidance elsewhere. There's guidance in the rest of the RDI guide, but it's about improving existing work practices rather than defining those work practices. And similarly, the aim, the objective, is to achieve these improvement goals. And these improvement goals are to do with quality objectives and business objectives. So the aim, the objective is not to just achieve a specific rating or level. And I think there was some discussion within the FDA when they set off on this maturity assessment pilot. They felt that there was a risk of defined levels because it would, or potentially it could, reinforce a compliance driven mindset. Kind of, okay, we got to 3, now we don't need to do any more because we're okay, we've achieved that baseline, which led them not to actually use levels in their pilots. But we decided it was valuable to use levels just for clarity and also for consistency with other work that was happening in the industry. But anyway, there is a risk for using these levels because it could be seen as being an end in itself and some kind of, okay, we've got an acceptable compliance rating. It's not about that. It's about continuous improvement based on quality and business goals. So in reality, it is a continuum rather than discrete levels or steps. Yes, that's understood. There could be grey areas where you could be straddling levels, almost certainly. And companies vary from function to function, also with mergers, acquisitions, etc. There could be some very complicated structures. So companies or parts of companies may span more than one level, may display characteristics of more than one maturity level. I think the key point there is that we need to very well define the scope of any particular assessment in case of any confusion and misunderstanding. So there we have 2 two diagrams there from the RDI guide. We see levels 1 to 5. Level 1, undefined, uncontrolled, not monitored, no evidence. Level 2, partially defined, not formally controlled, not formally monitored, pretty much person dependent. Level 3, some defined policies and processes, but inconsistent application and inconsistent monitoring. By the time we get to level 4, we're in the green zone, a defined policy and established processes which are being routinely applied and routinely monitored. But we'd like to get to the situation where we're proactive and continuously improving it based on feedback. And we chose to color code them like that so that they could be extracted to some kind of senior management dashboard with red, amber, green if necessary. But it wasn't necessarily to imply that there was a kind of no-go area and that you had to achieve a certain level to be compliant. So within the model, there are process areas. So those are the areas that are to be assessed. And then for each of those process areas, there's maturity factor. So it's the characteristic that process areas are assessed against. Excuse me. And then there's also some maturity level characterizations. So these give examples of possible or typical states related to the levels. So you've got the areas, you've got the factors, and you've got the characterization. And that sounds all a bit abstract, so I'll show you some examples of what that means in practice. One thing before I get into the detail, I think one thing I should mention is that some of these areas are pretty much interdependent, and some of them are pretty fundamental, and they have a big impact on potential improvements in other areas. And I'm thinking, for instance, things to do with leadership, culture, and awareness, for instance. It's difficult to really improve in some areas if these fundamentals are not in place. But you see there, we have these process areas: culture, governance and organization, strategic planning and data integrity program, regulatory, data lifecycle, and the lifecycle supporting processes. Now, each of these process areas are further broken down, but for brevity, I've just shown you the example of how culture is broken down into DI, understanding and awareness, culture and working environment, and quality culture. But you'll find that the other process areas are also broken down as well. Now here, taking those that we saw there, the first three there, and the culture, those are the process areas. Those are the maturity factors. Awareness of importance and understanding of principles, a culture of willing and open reporting, willing collaboration, and then habitually following quality standards and consistently seeing others doing so. So those are the factors that we want to assess ourselves for each of those process areas. Now I've taken another example here just for interest. So there's a process area, data ownership, that's the maturity factor, clear ownership of data and data related responsibilities, that's what we're aiming for. And the characterization gives us a pretty good indication of what it's like to be at the various levels, because it's often easier for people to look at an example and compare themselves against an example rather than kind of applying an abstract definition. So in level 1, process, system, and data owners not defined, whereas at level 5, you've got process, system, and data owner responsibilities considered and clarified during management review, for instance. You see, and all points in between. Now, often moving from 3 to 4, which I think is probably quite a significant move in some organizations, is often moving from partial, inconsistent application to routine application. And achieving routine application leads to a virtuous circle of processes actually then starting to support each other, and personnel behavior reinforcing each other and reinforcing good practice. So this is moving from partial, inconsistent application to routine application is a really big step. And this is one reason why simple, understandable policies and processes are really critical, because it's no good aiming for complex over-compliance, that's not achievable routinely, because these won't be repeatedly and consistently achievable, and you won't get that virtuous circle. So that's what's in the RDI guide itself, but it doesn't stop there, because there's links to other GAMP and other ISPE guides. One, of course, is the recently published Good Practice Guide on Data Integrity Key Concepts, which takes some areas in the RDI guide, obviously particularly the key concepts, and drills down in further depth. And one thing I'm very happy to see, and very excited to see really, that this is very well aligned with wider work that's going on within ISPE, particularly the ISP Cultural Excellence Report. And I'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. But there's some great points made in the GPG about the role of leadership in organizational maturity. So leaders at all levels should clearly establish acceptable data integrity practices and show by their actions sincere and serious efforts to improve the overall data integrity maturity. And this maturity improvement is just not going to happen unless we have, as described here, these leaders at all levels showing by actions rather than just by setting policy, etc. And as they go on to say, vigilance requires monitoring the entire organization to assess and reassess the ongoing process of data integrity maturity, not just as a remediation project or initiative. So if this is just a one-off assessment put on the shelf, yep, we're in a decent place, we're not going to get the value. So it's ongoing monitoring of the entire organization to see if we're still achieving the maturity level, but obviously most importantly, are we continuously improving? So the GPG is very much aligned with this document, the ISP Cultural Excellence Report, which is easily available from ISPE. And I think this reflects that kind of paradigm shift as well, in that it talks about a move away from a traditional cultural compliance towards a culture of excellence, a shift from reliance, as it says, solely on compliance to an emphasis on continuous improvement, in which there is a deep understanding throughout the organization of the elements critical to product quality. And I think that's, if I talked about those three maturity factors that I thought underpinned all the others, leadership, culture, and awareness, that's all about that deep understanding. It's a deep understanding of the product and product quality, not just the rules that I have to follow to do my job. So in that cultural excellence report, there's the 6 dimensions of cultural excellence. You see them there. And within the document, they've defined a set of 21 key behaviors that support these 6 dimensions. And there is a cultural excellence assessment tool to help organizations assess the maturity of these 21 behaviors as part of their quality culture program. Now, it's much wider in its scope than what was included in the RDI guide, because that was taking factors that were really pretty much directly related to data integrity. But I don't think there'd be any inconsistencies, and they could be well used together. And it's also interesting to note that there are tools in the GPG that link back to these cultural excellence and behaviours. So, for instance, a Gemba walk in labs tool and some other tools as well. So it's really nice to see that the work we're doing here in GAMP is linking in with the wider work throughout ISPE. So we started off by looking at some of the things that were happening in the device area, and very clearly articulated in the FDA enforcement and quality report, particularly they're advocating a maturity based approach there. We looked at how maturity modeling is used or applied in the RDI guide, and it's mentioned in the main body, but there's a specific appendix within the management appendices that's all about the maturity model and how to apply it. And then we moved on to see how this fits in to the wider ISPE direction of patient-centric, cultural excellence, etc. And as often, if you know me well, I'd like to finish off with this point. I think this really says a lot about what it really means to be mature as an organization and what we should be aiming for. Staff following good practices from a position of awareness and understanding. We can't depend on policing and technical controls, even though those things are essential, especially the validated technical controls. But we're not in the business so much of preventing users from doing the right thing. We are in the business of facilitating users and all staff to do the right thing because they understand why, because they understand it's in their benefit, it's to their benefit, benefit of the organization, and obviously to the benefit of the patient. So to go back to that paradigm shift that the MHRA mentioned, it's moving from a primarily compliance-driven approach to the quality and risk-driven approach, which is really at the heart of GAMP 5 and the RDI guide and all the GPGs. So we're pushing for excellence, maturity, continuous improvement, and the word that I think we're hearing more and more from the regulatory authorities these days, which is innovation. It's our job to innovate for the benefit of the public. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll hand it back to the team. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I'm not sure Chris was here earlier, but yeah, I think that was really exactly what we were hoping to see and to hear from you. And in fact, I asked a question in the chat room earlier, which I think you kind of answered, or you mentioned it more than once. And I had to put in the question that said, have you seen organisations who insist that regulators don't accept behavioural and procedural controls and insist on those technical controls?
Yes, I think if we're looking at things at the very if we're looking at things at a very low level and you say there's a million things and we must have all these million things in place, it's easy to say we've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. We've really got to lift our view up and say, okay, this is the process, this is where the risk is. What's the appropriate control? It's not all about it's all about slamming in some function or putting in 3 more SOPs, and it's a much more nuanced approach. And regulators aren't stupid. They know if something's being done for a good reason. They know if it's been done for just to get a tick in the box. But it's a difficult. No, it's not a difficult sell, but sometimes it's a difficult sell because there are organisations who are still responding to the kind of their vision of a phantom evil investigator or an inspector who reality doesn't exist, but is made up of the worst elements of the worst inspectors, and say, yeah, but what if they turned up and we'd really screwed up and they were being completely unjust, then we might get into trouble. I said, well, that's not what we're in business for. We're
That's
in
not the
business to
mature
make.
view, right?
No, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so I mean, obviously as a vendor, I hear that part one quite a lot. And I put another question. There's not so many questions on there apart from mine, but I said as well that new FDA guidance. One of the first things I really noticed reading it was there was a whole section at the beginning that talked about the responsibilities of management and talked about overall governance. I wondered if you'd had any thoughts on that section that showed up that wasn't in the original in the draft guidance.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by that statement as well. In fact, there's quite a powerful paragraph that talks about management involvement, management influence, and saying that it's essential in preventing and correcting conditions that can lead to DI problems. And it talks about the kind of leadership role of management with executive responsibility to create a quality culture where employees understand that data integrity is an organizational core value, I think they say. Yeah. And then I think it moves on to talk about, okay, to encourage people to identify and report issues. It's a culture of openness. And without this management support, then systems, however technically correct, or quality systems, however sophisticated, will break down and will lead to non-compliance. So I think, yeah, FDA have come out and said it very clearly. I was also very happy to see in the PICS guide. There's a major section on organizational influences, and that some of the things the PICS guide talks about are very relevant to many of the maturity factors. It talks about critical thinking skills, which obviously is one of the key concepts of the RDI guide and something that's discussed in the new GPG. And they point out that an indicator of data governance maturity is how well an organization understands and accepts residual risk and how they prioritize actions based on that risk. And I think they make the point that if you believe that there's just no risk of failure, that it's likely that there's been an inadequate assessment of the inherent risks. So I think, for the regulators the inspectors are being told, as an indicator of maturity, how well does an organization really understand the risks and the appropriate controls, rather than just blindly saying, yep, there's 150 regulations we've got to follow, we've followed them all.
Yeah, they sound a little like Guy Wingate when he says, if you think you have no data integrity concerns, you're not looking hard enough.
Or ever the optimist guy.
Jim I asked a question as well, Sean. He said, what are your thoughts on the Acatech maturity model, which I don't know anything about, but maybe it's something that you know.
No, I don't. So no. if
maybe Jim will elaborate further down a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question here. Which organisation has implemented and measured their CMM? And then he goes on to say, Shearing Plough back in the mid-2000s was trying to do CMM for their IT operation, but not sure if that was ever implemented or not. So do you know anybody who has implemented and measured their CMM?
I believe that it's far more prevalent in the software areas, because obviously some of the original CMMs came from the need. Well, it was actually the US government wanting a tool to assess government contractor processes for software projects. So it started from very much a software framework, and it was more widely applied then. But I would suspect that there's more likely to be these types of formal CMMI assessments performed in software organizations, IT departments within, or technical departments within pharma, and within device companies where there's a highly technical software part. I don't know of any big pharma companies that have gone for the whole through the whole assessment process. I'm not sure if it would be feasible. I don't know.
Yeah, and Anubis, there's several IT companies in India do it for CMM and CMMI 5, level 5, so that kind of makes sense. Alison, are you on the line? Did you want to ask your question?
Oh,
maybe.
Yes,
Oh,
I didn't realise I could unmute myself. And my question was about mergers and acquisitions. If you've worked hard on your data integrity and maturity level and think that you've progressed quite far, if you have a significant reorganisation, then how do you get that recognised as an asset that should get continual investment? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think part of this is getting it is, as you say, I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is that if a particular part of a new organization has achieved a certain level of maturity, then it's the only way it can really be nurtured and then be good for the rest of the organization if it has been identified as such by sufficiently senior management. So I think if it can be then used as an evangelizing example, or as where there are tools and processes and knowledge bases that can be shared with the rest of the organization. But I'm convinced that the key thing is that somebody at a sufficient higher level must be able to see, right, okay, I can see why this set of practices is at a higher level than these sets of practices, and I'm going to ensure that the rest of the organization learns from it. So that's, I guess, if you don't have an inherently learning organization, I think you're going to struggle. And if you don't have that, if you don't have the leadership pushing continuous improvement, or at the very least maintaining the same level of quality rather than dumbing down to a kind of baseline level of compliance, I think it's not going to happen. But I think you've identified something that many organizations are struggling with at the moment.
But it's quite true as well, isn't it, Sean, when we were talking before, that you can have different levels of maturity in different parts of the organization as well. So even between companies, within a company, you're going to see some differences from department to department.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it will depend on, from data integrity perspective, who's, for historical reasons, has kind of been taking the lead on understanding the situation, who's been taking the lead on actually doing something about it, who's been taking responsibility. So not only, I think, will we see differences between different legacy pieces of different organizations, but you'll have different sites, you'll have different types of organizations. So you mean things in sites involved in manufacturing versus clinical versus distribution, etc. So those might be variations as well. But I think you may see, depending on who's been taking the lead, is it mainly being pushed by the business, or is it mainly being pushed by a technical group? Is it mainly being led by QA? You might find that they are then the kind of beacons. But I think that's actually one example problem or a difficulty for organizational maturity is if these things are being driven only by QA or only by the technical department, IT, etc., etc. It's got, or even, although this is the lesser of the three evils, I think, being driven by the business process owners. But if really to increase the level of maturity significantly, it's got to be definitely a three-way team: business process ownership, quality assurance, and regulatory, with the necessary technical team support, be it IT, engineering, vendors, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I guess a lot of these come down to figures often. So if there's some kind of cost saving or non-compliance, non-event saving that you could make in terms that was a matrix against the different CMM levels. I don't know if that might help, because what we always say about data integrity is it comes from the top down, so therefore it's persuading the new people at the top.
Yeah, and I think that you, again, very good point, and it's something that I believe from what they've been saying that the FDA are aware of this, and I think they're at pains to stress that that focus on quality enables better alignment of patient safety and business objectives, because what's good for one is good for the other very often. Yeah. So it's not one at the expense of another, so it's the business objectives supporting safety improvements, and safety improvements also improving the bottom line because of fewer adverse events, fewer recalls, and I think that might be the perspective. The FDA in that report is very interesting. Talks about having more data, responding better to adverse events, having more voluntary recalls and things like this, and the discussion might be better framed around the cost of a lack of quality rather than the cost of lack of compliance. Obviously, there's a cost to non-compliance, but really, if you're not achieving that baseline level of compliance, that's a pretty poor show. But there is another level of cost of quality to do with customer complaints, brand reputation, cost of recall, rework, all those things, and perhaps putting a monetary value on that might be a pretty significant case,
Right, thanks, Sean. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
We have about 6 more minutes until the end of the call. If there's any other questions, post them in the window and we'll ask them.
Yeah, Rory asked what level of CMM is deemed acceptable. I'm not really sure I understand the question, but I thought I would read that for you, Sean.
Well, I think there's a danger. That question is very enlightening, really, because I think that's what the FDA was slightly concerned about with their pilot. That there was a risk of having, if you had defined levels and you had certain idea that like our model, in the GAMP guide, it's got that amber there, and it's got green. So by definition, I think if we're applying that, you must say, well, okay, once you're in the green, you're okay. But I think there is a risk of levels reinforcing this mindset of, okay, we've got it 3, now we don't need to do any more. So I think there's the proper answer, which is, well, it really depends on what your organization is aiming for, really. And it's difficult to say that a level 4 organization is unlikely to be compliant. But I think it's a dangerous question, really.
I think it is. I think when I read it, I was thinking, isn't that exactly what Sean said they were trying to avoid? It's going, as long as you've got past this point, you're good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think originally we were thinking about a kind of 3-level approach when we were developing this, and then we had some definite feedback from the people who were using more sophisticated maturity models in the industry, saying, no, don't make it simplicity and yes, no, compliant, not compliant. Don't make it simply a kind of dashboard, red, amber, green, because it's not about just getting over the line. Again, it's about figuring out how you can improve your current work practices. And I keep coming back to this. We've got quality objectives and business objectives hand in hand. How can we best achieve those? And any measurement would be more based on those objectives rather than on rankings and ratings and things like this. But we felt we didn't have to, but we chose to go with 5 levels rather than a complete continuum, just for simplicity's sake, really.
Yeah.
But interesting point, Larry.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we need to wrap up. Any additional questions? Well, on that, thank you, Sean, for presenting today. We really appreciate the insights that you had, and thank you, everybody, for joining the call.
Thank you very much for arranging it, and it's been a pleasure, and thanks to all the team.
And we love
This.
Heather and Christopher, can you stay on the line?
Sure am.
Yep.